So today we're going to learn about national security currently. So problems that face world security today. We have 4 daily objectives. Number 1, list current challenges to national security. Number 2, explain why Russia invaded Ukraine. Number 3, explain the Iran-Saudi Arabian rivalry. And number 4, discuss the weaknesses of the Sykes-Picot Treaty. So, big takeaway right now is yesterday, the last few classes, we've been talking about terrorism and ISIS. This lesson is about resurgent nationalism. So remember, Fukuyama had 2 predictions, that resurgent nationalism and religious fundamentalism would be the 2 things that challenge national security in the post-Cold War order. Today, we're talking about resurgent nationalism. The past days, we talked about religious fundamentalism. So we talked about the post-Cold War order. Moral of the story is the USA is in charge, and it is in charge through several different international organizations, those being the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund. The United States of America spends more money on the military than the next 19 countries combined, on top of the fact that most of those countries are client states to the U.S. We talked about Fukuyama's predictions. 2 things would challenge world order: religious fundamentalism, resurgent nationalism. So we've got religious fundamentalism over on the right with ISIS. We've got resurgent nationalism on the bottom with Vladimir Putin. And that's what we're going to spend quite a bit of time today talking about. Finally, we talked about why people engage in terrorism. The moral of the story is it's because it works. Nobody wants to mess with a crazy person. So we've talked about nationalism before. Nationalism is a militant pride in one's nation. Remember, a nation is a group of people. Remember that fascism is an extreme form of nationalism. So if we look at Adolf Hitler on the right, he's going to be a fascist. He's going to be an extreme nationalist. He believes in the supremacy of what he called the Aryan people, which is Germans. We've got Vladimir Putin in the bottom middle. He's going to practice and believe in Russian nationalism. We're going to learn that his invasion of Ukraine has a lot to do with Russian nationalism. Bottom left, we see Mahatma Gandhi. So Gandhi is going to be a nationalist, an Indian nationalist. Now, he did not use violence. He used nonviolent protest. He was still a nationalist. He still helped India gain independence from Great Britain. So the big question today is, why is nationalism resurgent? So why do we have to deal with nationalism again? We dealt with it during World War II when we defeated the fascists, Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler. Why is it coming back? So let's look at that. First thing we're going to talk about is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So Ukraine is a country in Europe. It is between, if you look on the map, it is between Russia, Romania, Poland, and Belarus. Now, most of the countries on this side of Ukraine are members of the European Union and members of NATO. That makes them client states to the United States of America. We've got Russia over here, clearly not a client state. We've got Ukraine in the middle. Now, up until 2014, Ukraine was a 100% committed client state of Russia. They did whatever the Russians told them to do. And this was largely because Ukraine, up until the collapse of the Soviet Union, was actually part of the Soviet Union. It was one of the countries that broke away from Russia when the Soviet Union collapsed. So, 2014, the guy in charge of Ukraine is negotiating with Vladimir Putin a trade deal. And basically what happens was, in order to try and get a better deal, he goes to the European Union and says, hey, the Russians are offering us this. What can you offer? What can you offer us? So he's trying to play Russia and the EU against each other. So he starts telling people that, hey, maybe we'll join the EU, trying to prove to Russia that he means it so that he can get a better trade deal. He had no intention of ever actually joining the EU. He was 100% going to keep Ukraine with Russia. But he was just trying to get a good deal. The problem is people in Ukraine believed him. They thought they were actually going to join the EU. And they got really, really excited. Next thing you know, Russia gets scared. Because you've got hundreds of thousands of people in Kiev, the capital, protesting to join the EU. And the president of Ukraine says, hey guys, I was just kidding. We're really going to stick with Russia. The people of Ukraine are pissed off. So Russia gets angry. They're afraid that they're going to lose Ukraine to the EU. And of course, if they join the EU and NATO, that makes them a client state of the USA. So they're really afraid they're going to lose Ukraine to USA. So in 2014, in August, they decide to invade Ukraine. They launch a full-scale invasion with soldiers and tanks and airplanes and ships and everything you could think of. Now, they start in the Crimean Peninsula, down here on the bottom. Now, Russia uses this first justification to justify the invasion of Ukraine. They say that Crimea is a peninsula in the Black Sea, which is true. And Russia has naval bases in Crimea that Ukraine allows them to have. And they cannot let Ukraine join the EU and NATO because then Russia would lose its naval bases in Crimea. And they have to have the naval bases in Crimea in order to control the Black Sea. And they have to control the Black Sea in order so that they can get access to the Mediterranean. And they have to get access to the Mediterranean so that their ships can go into the Atlantic Ocean. Pretty complicated, but it's not that bad. So that is the original justification for the Russian invasion. That quickly changes. So if we look at this map on the right, this is a color-coded map of native languages of people that live in Ukraine. So the dark red, if a province, these are provinces in Ukraine, if a province is color-coded dark red, like Crimea, that means that 75% or more of the people that live there speak Russian as a native language, not Ukrainian. Ukrainian is a different language than Russian. So notice that this entire half of Ukraine, more than 25% of the people speak native Russian. In fact, it's much higher. It's closer to 74% for most of these provinces. So we've got a large population of people in eastern Ukraine that speak Russian as a native language. Now, why are they speaking Russian as a native language? Because they're Russians. They may not live in Russia. They may not have Russian citizenship. They may be Ukrainian citizens, but they are Russian. Just like people from Mexico, for example, come to the United States. They speak Spanish. That's their native language. They are Mexican. They can still be American citizens. They can still be Americans, but they also have this other identity, Mexican. Same thing in Ukraine. We've got lots of Russians that are living in eastern Ukraine. Russia, second justification for the invasion, Russia argues that they have to keep Ukraine friends with them because if Ukraine joins the EU and NATO, that is detrimental to all of the native Russians that live in the eastern part of the country. So, basically what ends up happening in Ukraine, and it's kind of ongoing, is that Russia invades eastern Ukraine and Crimea, conquers both, and there's kind of a puppet government over both areas. So Ukraine is an ongoing conflict with no clear resolution in sight. Next thing we're going to talk about is the Middle East. Now, Middle East is more religious fundamentalism than nationalism, but it kind of gets mixed up in the Middle East. Because in the Middle East, you don't really have nations so much. The nation isn't all that important. What is important is the sect of Islam you belong to. So just like in Christianity, there are sects in Islam. So some examples of sects in Christianity would be Baptist. Baptist is a sect. Catholic is a sect of Christianity. Methodist is a sect of Christianity. All of these sects are part of Christianity. You can still be Catholic and be Christian. They're the same thing. You can be Baptist and Christian. They're the same thing. Well, in Islam, there's lots of different sects, but the two big ones are Sunni and Shia. So if you're Sunni, you're also a Muslim. If you're Shia, you're also a Muslim. Same thing. Now, there are two major countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're the biggest in terms of territory. They're the most populous. They're the richest. Now, Saudi Arabia is a majority Sunni state. Iran is a majority Shia state. Now, both of these countries, being the biggest and most powerful, want to be the biggest guy in the region. They want to be the big kid on the block. They want to be the bully. So Iran and Saudi Arabia end up fighting quite a bit over who's going to be the boss of the Middle East. Now, they don't fight directly because notice they don't border. Iraq is between them. But they fight indirectly. And the way they fight indirectly is by funding terrorist groups. So Iran is going to fund Shia terrorist groups because Iran is Shia. And Saudi Arabia is going to fund Sunni terrorist groups because they are Sunni. in an effort to gain client states in the rest of the Middle East and thus become the biggest guy on the block. Now, what you need to understand is that they are not fighting because they are different. Saudi Arabia is not fighting Iran because Saudi Arabia is Sunni and because Iran is Shia. They're fighting because they both want to be the biggest kid on the block. They are using religion to organize. So, Saudi Arabia, being the major Sunni power, is going to ally with other Sunni powers because they have similarities. Iran, being the major Shia power, is going to buddy-buddy with the other big Shia powers because they have these religious similarities. But what they're fighting the Sunnis over is land, money, people, taxes, power. It's very important you realize that. We don't fight wars over religion. We fight wars over stuff. We organize based on religion. We organize based on nation. If we think about Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. Now, if we look at the map, we're going to notice that we've got two major colors. That is the dark green and the light green. The dark green is going to be Shia areas. The light green is going to be Sunni areas. Again, people aren't fighting over religion, they're fighting over stuff, but they're going to organize based on religion. The problem is, notice how the dark green and the light green are by and large mixed up amongst themselves. Except for Iran, which is clearly Shia. Most of the other countries are mixed. They have some light green, some dark green. And that is because of the Sykes-Picot Agreement made by the European victors of World War I. So prior to World War I, one country, the Ottoman Empire, which is now Turkey, here, one country, the Ottoman Empire, ruled the entire Middle East. Pretty much. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire lost. And the Ottoman Empire was broken into lots of different countries. The countries that now exist in the Middle East. Now, Europeans are the ones who created the new countries out of the old Ottoman Empire. They're the ones who drew the lines. And they drew the lines kind of sort of however they wanted to draw the lines. Largely based on where the oil was, because they divided up the countries in the Middle East amongst themselves. The problem is they did not take into account where the Sunnis and the Shias lived. So they ended up drawing countries around groups that were both Sunni and Shia. And that has led to serious internal strife in many of these countries because the Sunnis don't trust the Shias and the Shias don't trust the Sunnis, and they're fighting over who's going to control the government. They're not fighting because they're religious. They're fighting because they want to control the government. They are organizing based on religious identity. Very important. This is exactly what happened in Iraq. So, prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein was a Sunni dictator in Iraq. Now, he wasn't really that religious. He considered himself an Arab first and foremost. Arab is the nation that most Middle Easterners belong to. Just like Germans are German. Now, Saddam Hussein, as a brutal dictator, kept all of the religious sects in line in Iraq, and he stayed in charge. He stayed the dictator. When we overthrew Saddam Hussein and we took over the country, we tried to establish a democratic government in its place. The problem is, a majority of people in Iraq, if we look at the map, the majority of people in Iraq are Shia. So, guess who won the most seats in the government, in the democratic government? It was Shias. So, the Shia majority began making rules for everybody. And guess who they excluded? They excluded the Sunnis. So the Sunnis got screwed. The Shias got everything. And next thing you know, you've got a civil war in Iraq. You've got the Sunnis and the Shias fighting each other because they're trying to figure out who's going to be the boss of the country. And next thing you know, ISIS forms, a Sunni-dominated terrorist organization. These things are all related. It's very important. We, the United States of America, prior to pulling out of Iraq, could not figure out a way to solve this religious tension. We couldn't figure it out. That's a problem. Because this is a problem that is happening across the Middle East. And it's the biggest reason why the Middle East is in the mess it is in currently. Let's talk about the Syrian civil war specifically. Syria, here on the top left, notice how it borders Iraq. This is Iraq. Syria and northern Iraq, this is northern Iraq, the blue area, are currently the major battlefields of the Sunni Shia, Iran-Saudi Arabia conflict. So remember, Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting over who's going to be the biggest, baddest dude on the block. The Syrian civil war is the main battlefield. It's the big battle of that war. Iraq is a majority Shia country. Sunnis, as we just mentioned, in northern Iraq, did not trust the Shia ruling Iraqi government. Many of them, combined with help from Saddam Hussein's old destroyed army, formed ISIS to create their own Shia government. Their own Sunni government. Unlike most terrorist groups, ISIS holds territory and taxes its citizens. Why are they able to hold territory and tax its citizens? Because the people in areas ruled by ISIS, a lot of them like ISIS. Because they're Sunnis, and because ISIS is Sunnis, and they'd rather be ruled by Sunnis than they would the Shia in Baghdad. Last thing we're going to talk about is the South China Sea in Asia. Now, this really isn't nationalism quite as much as it is just your typical expansion, but it is important, and it is something that is challenging international security in Asia. Pretty much the biggest thing challenging international security in Asia. So the South China Sea, this area right here, is a body of seawater in South Asia, so it's south of China. Now, much of the world's trade between Asia and the Americas comes through the South China Sea. It comes between these islands, especially through Malaysia. Now, China is attempting to claim the South China Sea. Why? Because they want to control the trade. And the way they have started claiming the sea is they have actually begun building islands in the middle of the sea. You pound up enough dirt, you get an island. Chinese are doing that. And they build aircraft, they build aircraft bases and naval bases on these little islands. This threatens U.S. trade interests. We, the United States of America, do not like this. It is also a way, more generally, to show the world that China is not afraid of the USA. So another very important area, another ongoing conflict. Take a few minutes, answer your daily objectives.